Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our virtual UN Water Conference virtual interactive session about overcoming obstacles for reflexive research practices in water governance. It's perspective from 15 early stage researchers. Just to remind you, if you have any questions or comments, and if you want to say hi and leave where you are from, please use the comment button. And if you have questions, then you can use the Q&A button below. Next. So our program agenda today will be a welcome and NEWAVE network introduction. That's by me, Snaf Kashkirmawalde. And then we will have an ESR presentation of the policy brief presented by Donna and Paula. And then after that, we will have a question for panelists and discussion moderated by Radhika. And then the last part will be Q&A with the audience moderated by Gina and Hannah. Yeah, for those of you who understand Spanish, we also have a translator. So you just go down the button. You can switch the language between English and Spanish. So NEWAVE Network is a Marie Curie Innovative Training Network under the EU Research and Innovation Program, Horizon 2022. NEWAVE is rooted in the conviction that rising threats of future water crisis and hydrosocial challenges present an urgent need to enhance the global capacity to reflect critically on the current water governance trajectory. NEWAVE approached the challenge of water governance from three interrelated angles, problematics, paradigms, and pattern, as we call them the 3 Ps. So the first P, problematics, allow the NEWAVE team to critically probe the nature of contemporary water problems, to diagnose them, and to develop an understanding of the socio-hydrological conditions in which paradigms are diffused and governance approaches are tried out. The second P, paradigm, allows to engage with the ideation of underpinning the water governance, making it possible to understand why proponents of certain approaches have come to accept and embrace them, why they propagate them, and how global circulation of ideas about governance works. The third and the last P is called patterns, and that allows to explicitly uncover the socio-environmental impacts of various patterns and modes of governance, and in turn assess their performance. So the NEWAVE Early Researcher has 15 young researchers working on water governance, and as you can see on the picture, and then we are all hosted in this universities located in Europe, Africa, and Europe and Africa. Thank you, Gina. So the organizing team of this panel discussions are me, which is Sinafikash, and I'm working on water and migration based in Politecnico di Milano University. And we have Radhika from University of Nairobi working on drought and mitigation. Paula with Fundación Nueva Cultural del Agua working on knowledge and co-production. And we have Hannah from University of Van Amsterdam working on water and migration. And we have Donna from Virgin University Amsterdam working on recommending water. And at last, the last ESR, Gina, working on informal markets from University of Oxford. We also have our lovely assistants, Paulina and Katrina, who have been helping us to organize these sessions on the background. And Katrina is our affiliated researcher. For panelists, we have Mildot, an executive director from Aquafed, and he has past experience in the UN Water, Sanitation, and Water for All Partnership and Youth Advocate. He will be joining us a bit late in about 10 minutes. And we have Sarah Van Borek, also postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto, but based in South Africa. She's also a video producer, educator, and researcher. We also have Ricardo Camilo from Colombia. He's a social movement leader and also an ecologist by study. And at last but not the least, we have Siddharth Agrawal. He's a founder of Veditum India Foundation and has background in anthropology and environmental research. These are our partner organizations working with us with all the 15 ESRs from around the globe. Now I will pass the presentation to Donna and Paula. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sina. And thank you everyone for joining us. So today, as Sina mentioned, Paula and myself will aim to walk you through our policy brief that we're putting forward, particularly for the UN Water Conference, but also beyond these walls here. And the idea behind it is to invite reflection collectively. So we welcome your inputs and your thoughts. Hopefully by the end of the session, we will be taking the additional inputs and contributing our statement through your inputs and our reflection to the UN as a statement. Before, just to frame a little bit, how did we get to this invitation and what have we identified? Basically, the purpose behind our policy brief is that as early stage researchers, and there's 15 of us looking at water governance from 15 unique angles and lenses, we came together to practice reflexivity in our own right, which is reflecting inwardsly and asking ourselves, what is our role as academics in looking at water governance challenges? And also to invite a reflection process around what are the obstacles that are limiting reflexivity in both academic and policy arenas on who is doing water governance, how it is being done, and for what purpose? Okay, so this is the main problem that we've identified. It falls under three main points. The first one is about dominant approaches and paradigms in water governance that lead to the neglect and sidelining of critical perspectives. And I can say that having been at the sessions for the last 2 days at the UN Water Conference, we've really noticed this quite a lot. There are paradigms, and just to name one in particular is the integrated water management paradigm, but there are, of course, other paradigms that continue to be circulated. And we've noticed that critical perspectives or spaces for perhaps dissent or challenging some of the dominant approaches are often sidelined or siloed. The second point is around the power dynamics between actors that create imbalances in discourses and knowledge systems. So very importantly, we've picked up on a few concepts and points of discussion that have been going on at the UN Water Conference. And we realized that some concepts have been co-opted. For example, water stewardship, notions around transformation, common good and good governance. And so, and even the notion of collective action. Often some of these words have emerged from circles, let's say, of activists and social movements. And they've been co-opted in ways where in some panels by multinational corporations speaking about these concepts in ways that, in my observation, have reduced them to, for example, initiatives around planting trees and looking at water footprint. So just problematizing some of these dynamics. And the last one is around limited accessibility of water-related data, which impedes further research and decision-making processes. We will be unpacking these. Next slide, please. And we'll speak about each one a little bit more. So in the next set of slides, we'll be walking you through our provocations. So this is by no means a recipe. It's actually our way of putting forward some questions to invite reflexivity. And we welcome any thoughts or reflections that you might have on this. The first limitation and an invitation to overcome it is around addressing the limitations of academic institutions. So the question we're putting forward is, how do normative research methods replicate colonial and extractive approaches to knowledge production? We hope to unpack this a little bit more with our resource guests, but in particular, we're referring to remote laboratories, this notion that we've reflected internally about, of researchers sitting at their desks, perhaps often in institutes, let's say in the global north, which global north and south in themselves could be even problematized as notions, but conducting research in other parts of the world. And so this distance and remote research is something that often happens, but that we want to problematize and invite reflexivity around. How do we engage in action research and co-creation approaches with local case studies and communities in different parts of the world in ways that also acknowledge their inputs into the research? The second point is building on that first one, acknowledging and questioning biases of what research is considered useful, neutral, or legitimate. So how, as researchers, are we being pushed to prioritize mainstream ways of knowing and doing in water governance? Particularly, this is incentivized by what grants are offered to which type of projects, which mainstream journals are the ones that publish on which topics. And so often you hear that critical perspectives and voices are limited to certain journals, but don't make it into mainstream ones. And the last point that I will speak to is critically engaging with information collection practices. This is a really important question that as researchers, we've bumped up against quite a lot in conducting our research, which is limitations around data collection practices, considering how and by whom knowledge is kept and controlled. We've had limitations around accessing data from water utilities, both private but also public, from high-level organizations. And so at NEWAVE, our commitment is to have open source research and data and publishing. So how do we encourage more of this in the water governance arena among practitioners and in academic research? Now I will pass it to my colleague, Paula, who will be switching to Spanish. So I invite those following in English to go into the interpretation button and switch to English. And our interpreter will also switch languages.
Hola a todos y todas. Un placer estar aquí. Yo también hago parte de la red. Y soy una colombiana haciendo investigaciones en España, que creo que también habla de estos retos y de lo que implica hacer investigación en otros lugares. En este caso yo hoy les voy a compartir el resto de las acciones que identificamos entre los 15 investigadores. La primera es reconocer el vínculo entre tierra y agua. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos visibilizar las conexiones entre tierra, entre los ecosistemas terrestres y los ecosistemas acuáticos? Y sobre todo repolitizar el agua. Usualmente el agua se toma más como H2O, ¿no? Como una especie de elemento químico, un recurso que se mueve, pero se invisibiliza la dimensión política asociada a esta. O a veces también se representa como un elemento clave en el nexo agua, energía y comida, pero se pierde de vista elementos relevantes en cuanto a distribuciones inequitativas de los impactos en la calidad del agua, por ejemplo, en el caso en el que yo trabajo con la eutrofización de cuerpos de agua marinos o oceánicos. El otro que tenemos, la otra acción que hemos identificado fue reflexionar críticamente sobre las limitaciones a nivel institucional. Y esto se refiere, por un lado, a los marcos legislativos o legales existentes que difícilmente permiten lidiar con los retos que implica el cambio climático y estos nuevos fenómenos de altísima incertidumbre. Y allí entonces estamos pensando en nuevas formas de investigación un poco más flexibles y también unas formas de institucionales que permitan darle espacio a los distintos actores sociales y los retos que estos enfrentan. Luego hemos titulado Complejizar y desafiar aproximaciones binarias y simplistas a la gobernanza del agua como la siguiente acción. Y allí creemos que es importante romper binarios que existen actualmente, como lo son formal e informal, control caos, técnico político, público o privado, público o común. Creemos que uno de los retos que hemos tenido nosotros haciendo investigación en distintos contextos del mundo es que estos binarismos nos limitan no solo a la hora de reportar lo que estamos encontrando, sino en entender lo que las comunidades locales y los actores sociales están haciendo y están enfrentando. Entonces, también aquí queremos preguntar cómo podemos darle espacio a estos nuevos enfoques locales que están emergiendo que no se corresponden con esos binarismos. Y por último, la next slide. Thanks. Tenemos reflexionar cómo el diseño y el uso de métricas promocionan ciertas políticas y paradigmas. Y aquí digamos que uno de los elementos interesantes de nuestro trabajo ha sido la interacción entre algunos de nosotros que venimos de contextos de educación un poco más positivistas, de ciencias naturales, versus otros compañeros que están en las ciencias sociales, y todas estas discusiones en torno a las métricas, qué métrica se considera neutra o que no está permeada por la política. Y aquí nos hacemos preguntas de, bueno, ¿cómo podemos aproximarnos críticamente a las métricas que se están usando para medir el éxito o la efectividad de cierto tipo de proyectos enfocados en la gobernanza del agua, y cómo esto puede ser altamente limitado, digamos, si no lo miramos críticamente, puede estar invisibilizando una serie de inequidades e injusticias que también se refieren a injusticias ancestrales desde el punto de vista de esas otras formas de conocer el mundo que quizás no se vinculan a este tipo de métricas. Con esto termino y le doy el paso a Radhika, que va a iniciar el panel con nuestros invitados. Espero que lo disfruten y nada, bienvenidos.
Hi, everyone. I'll be speaking in English, so feel free to switch back on your translation, on the translation button. So for the next 30 minutes, we're going to hear from our 4 amazing panelists, all of who have different perspectives, use different methodologies in their research, and are working also in different parts of the world. So the way the next 30 minutes will go is that each panelist will have 7 minutes to answer. And when there's 1 minute to go, I will just turn my video on so that you know you only have 1 minute left. So we've put together specific questions for each panelist. So feel free to respond to the question, but then also to incorporate any reactions or comments you had to the policy brief as a whole. So my first question is directed towards Sid. Sid is the founder of Veritam, as Sina had mentioned earlier on in the presentation. And I've worked with Veritam before, and what makes them so interesting is that they carry out very different and unique ways of the research. So Sid, for instance, we know that you've done, I don't know, dozens, maybe hundreds at this point of river walks all around India. And you've done this to try to understand the different ways in which people engage with rivers, how people perceive rivers, and how they depend on rivers in all of these different ways. So my question has to do with the partnerships that you form during the course of your research. We all know that partnerships are vital when carrying out research, but the way that partnerships are handled after the research is conducted often differs. So I'm curious about, in your work, how you go about building ethical and sustained partnerships with the local actors and institutions that you collaborate with. And in your opinion, is it necessary to build sustained partnerships in order for a research to be considered ethical? So if you could please talk a little bit about that, drawing on your own experiences, and then also responding to the presentation. And just as a reminder, you have 7 minutes. Thank you, Sid.
Right. Thanks so much, Radhika. I'm very happy to be here. Answering your question, which I think is an extremely important question, as somebody who is a young researcher, somebody who's been in the field for maybe less than a decade, and seeing a lot of research around me. As part of my work, the one thing that works to my advantage is that I am an activist, and I don't shy away from calling myself an activist. And we have a priority of placing the interest of the communities first, which allows us to be very open in forming partnerships and relationships with communities that we interact with while on our river walks. And in the past, it's not always been perfect. It's also been a journey of making mistakes, having failures, of not always being able to maintain that relationship given the scale at which we have been working, but we are improving on the relationship building with our communities. The first thing I think is that we do practice is to be constantly in touch with many of the local actors and partners that we work with. And it's essential because they can often feel that they are the actors who are coming from external locations are there only to extract information for a selfish use which is happening somewhere else, and which is a paradigm that we together are offering to challenge right now, and which is also very much reflected in the policy brief that you have offered as a group. And there is this colonial mindset that continues to exist even within progressive circles, where the local communities are only looked at as subjects and not as partners, are looked at as subjects for us to extract information, and which continues to be a challenge, especially when there's in one space where there is the media which sometimes parachutes in and goes out, but also in terms of research, that there is a fair bit of parachuting that happens in and out. Thankfully, increasingly so that at least I've witnessed it around me, that more and more individuals have started building that long-term relationship with an intention to continue being in touch with the people that they are meeting and working with them. It's the challenges that we face right now. Some of the terms that I'm using are also in your policy brief, which talk about how the neoliberal paradigm has made it a lopsided situation where communities themselves do not have access to information that is being generated from their locations. In fact, unfortunately, a few years ago, a lot of the water quality data, which was very localized, was available for villages across India, is unfortunately no longer available. And this was created using public money by the government institutions. And this is not available anymore in the public domain. And this kind of imbalance where communities were actually using that kind of information to demand for better services, to demand for a better quality water, has taken a backseat because that information is no longer available, which was something that communities could have used in the past. And another thing that's really happening, where the partnership with between researchers and experts and communities is really important, is that the current paradigm of the market society is also pushing for the commodification of not just water itself, not just the privatization of water, but it's also pushing heavily for the commodification of the data around water. And when there is this constant push towards towards profit making around each aspect of the water cycle, then the alienation of communities who share a direct relationship physically, that starts to break. And the systems that exist, the administration that exists, then ends up trying to enforce the separation between community and their resource. Another important point that was mentioned, and I'm also sort of weaving in the response to the policy brief, which I think is important, is the land and water equation, where especially for subsurface water, groundwater, which is not visible, the entanglement of land and water is extremely crucial to look at and acknowledge, because we've had this challenge within India where there was larger landholding by small groups of people, which has evolved over time to become a more distributed landholding, but it's still not perfect. And this relation between land and water, based upon how laws currently are in India, dictate who can extract water from where. So the land and water question becomes as very important. The one thing that I definitely thought was maybe missing from the policy brief, especially given the current climate context that we live in, the missing allotment of water to non-human entities. I think that's extremely important as we deal with the Anthropocene, that we come out of the mindset of allocation only to human entities and also allot water resources to non-human entities, so they may survive, so they may thrive, and who also often play such an important role in maintaining our ecosystems, which enable us to use those freshwater ecosystems for our personal uses. So the ecosystem services, not in a commodification sense, but in a way of acknowledging that beyond the human, beyond the anthropogenic perspective, is also our entities which require the same water that we are allocating amongst us. So I'll pause there and back to you, Radhika.
Thank you so much, Sid. You really touched upon so many points that were so interesting and really important for us to keep in mind. And we also really appreciate you pointing out some of the gaps in our policy brief, because this is something we're trying to improve on and learn from. So thanks very much, Sid. And yeah, I think some of the really important points also are something that I'm going to ask Sarah, our next panelist, to talk about when we discuss the way in which she uses a decolonial lens to her research. So for instance, Sid, you talked about how often local communities are looked as subjects to extract information from, and this information, even after it's collected and analyzed, isn't maybe even accessible to the community where the information came from in the first place. You also talked about the commodification of information and data, and also this, as you brought up, this very anthropocentric perspective of water and its uses is also very much part of this colonial lens. So Sarah, my question to you is, could you give us some specific examples of how you apply a decolonizing lens to your research? Maybe you could tell us some of the questions that you ask yourself when you're carrying out research, and how these questions inform the practices and methods that you choose to work with. And just to add a little bit more to that, we as a network have talked a lot about what decolonizing research actually means. So we'd be super curious in your own personal take and the way that you yourself have applied it. Thank you. And just as a reminder, 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the NEWAVE Network for organizing this really important conversation and for inviting me to be a part of it. I just wanted to start off also by clarifying a little bit my own kind of positionality and where I'm coming from. So I was born and raised in Canada, but then I spent most of my formative years in rural areas across Africa, and have lived in South Africa for more than 10 years, which is where I'm presenting from today. And so that's had a big influence in, I think, the way that, that I kind of go about my own ways of knowing and understanding. And I also wanted to mention that I started off in an arts background, media arts, and then in an education background, working in an arts university, leading community engaged sustainability courses, where we were very much experimenting with place-based learning, where the inevitability of the connections between land and water came up, as well as relations with Indigenous communities and other communities. And that led me into an interest in research and eventually doing my PhD here in South Africa. And so maybe I'll just start a bit with what I mean by a decolonizing practice, first of all, or a decolonizing lens. So for myself, it's really about acknowledging and valuing diverse knowers and knowledges, and using modalities and processes that meaningfully engage them. And I'll explain that a little bit more. So I want to share a little bit about kind of how I came to be thinking about things in this way, or working in this way. And my PhD work had a lot to do with that. So doing a PhD in environmental education here in South Africa, my work was really about designing a university water curriculum, and that was something that I was piloting both in the Canadian context and in the South African context. And it was also inspired by discourses around reconciliation education in Canada, and eventually the decolonizing higher education discourse in South Africa and other parts of the world. And through that process, I uncovered higher education's complicity in exacerbating the global water crisis, with a few examples, the ways that it biases cognitive knowledge and academic reading and writing, the way that it can leave key perspectives out of solution making, the way that it can promote narratives of water as a commodity, and also the kind of habit of underestimating the role of emotions in behavior change. So I'd say through that process, I started to recognize the need to decolonize water governance, as well as a water curriculum that was intended to take place in higher education institutions. And so when it comes to sort of my reflexivity practice, I would say that this has led me to focus on sort of 4 key elements in terms of the kinds of questions I might ask myself. It's really about knowledge, about power, about relationships, including the one between knowledge and power, and how I see myself fitting into all of that, and about modalities. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So I wanted to offer just some very specific questions that I think are kind of embedded in the way that I try to work. Specifically, whose knowledge is it that we're talking about, or that I'm trying to engage with? What kind of knowledge or way of knowing? Is it embedded in a particular culture or language? Is it nonverbal, for example? Is it implicit? Is it affective, meaning that it has a lot to do with emotions and emotional engagement? Is it formal or informal? And how is this knowledge produced or shared? Who might this knowledge serve and how? And who belongs in this process of learning, in this experience, those sorts of things. So I think back to the beginning of your question, which is how do these questions and this kind of approach, how does it influence or inform some of my practices and methods? So I would say that it ultimately does influence sort of every aspect of the research, from who will be a part of the research, how data will be collected and analyzed, and how data will be shared. And the concept of knowledge translation has become really prominent in my work, I think in the collection side as well as the sharing side. And so I generally use a lot of participatory arts-based methods. I would say that it, for me, is one of the ways to really broadly engage different forms of knowledge, and also kind of simultaneously engage in sort of knowledge translation processes. And so I wanted to share just a couple of examples from some of my work. So in my PhD work, as I mentioned, the water curriculum was really about engaging students in self-filming, which is essentially making films on smartphones. And as part of that process, they met with local knowledge keepers who had relationships with water bodies, and where their knowledge of the water bodies was based on lived experience and not on technical training or academic experience. And it was through a sort of relationship and storytelling process that that knowledge was exchanged, and new narratives were created that were shared with broader communities. In my postdoc work, we're working with young people in Kenya, building on their cultural strengths in song-making process as a part of participatory mapping. And related to that, maybe I can see it's almost time to wrap up, but I think it speaks to some of the points in your policy brief and builds on what Sid shared around partnership work. So I am being mentored by Professor Carmen Logie, and I really admire her partnership model, where we work with local organizations within Kenya who do most of the field work there. And even within that model, we have peer navigators who are also participants from the same demographic as the community we're working with. They're directly involved in participant recruitment, sometimes as facilitators as well. And so I've been learning a lot from that. I think we'll wrap it up there, but I'm looking forward to any further discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. It was so interesting to learn a little bit more about the questions that you ask yourself, and a little bit more of your journey as well to where you are right now. And I think this also ties really well with our policy brief, in the sense of how do we try to acknowledge these super diverse ways of knowing, a lot of which isn't necessarily legible and isn't necessarily made explicit, but how do we sort of give those forms of knowledge the same amount of importance and the same amount of value as we do for some other forms. And I think also so important that you had pointed out the level of complicity in a lot of higher education institutions in pushing forward certain narratives about what kinds of knowledge are prioritized and are considered useful and legitimate, and which ones aren't. So Thank you so much, Sarah. So my next question will go to Camilo, who's a social movement leader from Colombia. So to try to connect it a little bit to what Sarah was talking about, there are so many different types of knowledge, and I can imagine that in areas or in regions that are a little bit more volatile, it's very important to consider those types of knowledge and the value that they bring. So Camilo, it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about the struggles and injustices that you faced in the context of your research in this area, and how it shaped the way that you approach different forms of knowledge or ways of knowing. And finally, could you please talk a little bit about the ways in which working in this particular region has shaped the way that you conduct research? Thank you.
Buenos días para todos, a los panelistas y por supuesto a todos los que están conectados. Es para mí un honor estar con ustedes y compartir un poco el trabajo que se viene haciendo. Hago parte de la nación Arhuaca de la Sierra Nevada al norte de Colombia. Coordino actualmente la Comisión Nacional de Territorios Indígenas de los Pueblos Indígenas y creamos un observatorio de derechos territoriales de los pueblos indígenas con un solo fin. Uno, producir información acerca de investigaciones que nos llevaran a los pueblos indígenas a defender nuestros intereses en diálogo y concertación con el gobierno nacional y otras instituciones. Debido a lo siguiente, el acceso a veces a la información y a los datos son complejos a las luchas que estamos presentando hoy los pueblos indígenas. Un ejemplo de ello es en el marco del contexto de hacerle en el marco de buscar soluciones inmediatas y rápidas al calentamiento global, se vienen realizando diferentes acciones y actividades en el marco de la implementación de las políticas públicas. Por ejemplo, en la Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, una de las medidas que se ha dado porque se han venido secando las cuencas ha sido la creación de diferentes represas alrededor de represamiento de diferentes ríos que bajan. Y esto encuentra dos maneras, dos mundos de interpretar y concebir el mundo. Desde el mundo indígena, el agua debe correr. Ese ciclo no se debe romper, ese ciclo es dinámico entre las conexiones de montaña y mar y por supuesto todo el ciclo hidrológico, más allá sobre también la importancia espiritual, cultural de los pueblos indígenas en relación con el agua, porque allí están las madres de diferentes entidades que no vemos, pero que existen. La ruptura de esto lleva entonces a que esos ciclos naturales, pero también esas conexiones espirituales de entendimiento y relación milenaria, se rompan. En ese sentido, cuando las soluciones son represamiento de agua, entonces entran dos concepciones de mundo que uno sobrepesa en el otro y que a veces tener argumentos técnicos científicos es complejo accederlo y por supuesto defender nuestra manera de entender y comprender el mundo y que eso sea vinculante en las políticas públicas. Por eso a nosotros nos toca estarnos reinventando, es decir, buscando medidas que contribuyan a detener esas políticas que se han hecho a través del reconocimiento de territorios colectivos para poder defender los espacios sagrados, pero también buscar figuras de protección ambiental territorial como han sido los traslapes entre resguardos indígenas y parques nacionales en lo que está sucediendo hoy día en la Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Por eso las investigaciones tienen que estar más de cerca y entender un poco esas relaciones y cómo se busca de que eso sea vinculante lo académico con las políticas públicas que están afectando directamente a los territorios colectivos indígenas y de actores sociales. En ese sentido, nosotros vimos la necesidad de la importancia de nosotros empezar a producir investigaciones con una rigurosidad técnica, por supuesto, pero que respondan a las necesidades prácticas y reales que están viviendo y demandando los territorios indígenas. Por eso, esa necesidad ha llevado a que hoy hubiésemos tenido que crear un observatorio de derechos territoriales en el cual hemos sacado investigaciones que lo que buscan son posicionar elementos de interés nuestro con argumentos técnicos que eso sirva para nosotros defender nuestros intereses, pero también cómo se busca demostrar la importancia de los territorios colectivos frente a la demanda que hay. En ese sentido, un componente muy importante ha sido los recursos hídricos. Hoy cada vez hay más demanda, hay más presión sobre la creación de represas como respuesta para darle resultados o resolver las necesidades rápidas que tienen y demandan las zonas urbanas, no pensando en en largo plazo de la protección de las mismas cuencas, sino de resolver de manera transitoria la problemática del agua, que una vez agotadas las represas, entonces viene la extracción, por supuesto, la extracción acuífera del suelo. En ese sentido, nosotros seguiremos avanzando en la defensa del territorio, en la defensa del agua, como parte fundamental y estructural de la pervivencia de los pueblos indígenas y esa relación espiritual y cultural que tenemos entre el agua y los pueblos y la relación con otros seres naturales que componen el entorno.
Hey, thank you so much, Camilo. It was so interesting to hear a little bit more about your research and the way in which you approach gathering the research. And I think what really stood out is how when you are carrying out research, it is for a very specific and practical need that you're doing that. And in that way, you're sort of ensuring that the research that you carry out will be of use to the communities and to the people that need it the most and could benefit it from the most. So my next question is to Neil. And so Neil is the executive director of AquaFed, which is an international advocacy group that connects international organizations with private water and wastewater service providers. So part of AquaFed is to have a global center of information and knowledge about private water operators and public-private partnerships that exist. So Neil, my question for you is, when you're thinking about the sort of information that you would want to gather, how do you decide what data to collect? And also, how do you decide how to portray it? And are there any things that sort of fall through the cracks that you aren't able to present due to the limitations of the medium or due to the expectations that you faced of what information you should have, and or if there are any pressures to present information in a certain way. So could you talk a little bit about that and how you navigate sort of being a center of information and data that a lot of other organizations and people and networks can use, and how do you think about the responsibility of having the center of data and information? Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm calling from a very noisy UN building in New York here. So I suppose the first question was about which data do we collect? The data we have, and I'm going to talk about our members because we're the federation, but so private utilities will collect data that is based on service and performance. And there are depending on the country or group of countries, there's very set parameters that the public authority will want to see. And again, they're very sort of quantitative and kind of service-based focused on things, on the basics of utility provision. For example, water quality, service interruptions, leakage, these kind of things that you'd expect from a utility. Now, private operators, one of the things we pride ourselves on and differentiates us is our ability to collect this data. And this is why often we are brought in to work on behalf of the public authority, so the public utility, is because we are able to collect this data and we have expertise on it. And let me just be clear on one thing. Private operators work under contract from public authorities, okay? And it's the public authority that manages the contract, sets the contract, and also sets the terms of the contract in terms of what specific KPIs are required, right? So that is decided, it's discussed by the private operator and the public authority, but it's finally set by the public management. So if you hear this thing that's heard a lot, that privatization and private companies do what they like, well, from public authorities. So essentially that is kind of the data that we produce. Now, you asked about the constraints on publishing that data. As far as we are concerned, we believe all data that we collect should be made totally transparent, because we're working under market rules, or that's the mentality that we have. And therefore, in a market, for a market to work perfectly, you have to have complete data. All right. So you will always have a private operator willing to provide that data. The decision, and this is the crucial point, the decision lies with the public authority. They decide what data gets published or doesn't get published. But as far as we're concerned, we are very happy to publish that data properly. Things that fall through the cracks are, well, I guess if you're looking at it another way, there's more data that I would like to see in terms of more in terms of the outcomes, because we look at it very much from the service point of view, the kind of service going out to the user. What we'd like in return, which we don't have, is user behavior, for example, or we don't have much of it. It's starting to be collected, but we need much more to understand these kind of issues, things like behavioral economics and customers' willingness to pay. That's something that happens, but I think that's still very, very important, and that's the kind of thing that we need to understand much better. So I'll stop there for a second, because I wondered if people had any questions, or you had any, Radhika. But just one last thing, because there's a comment from Cherzy here, who says there's a disconnect between water management entities, including utilities, and end users in terms of communication. This is a very good point. I don't actually, I'm not sure, I don't totally agree with that, but more to the point, I've done a bit of work with some young researchers based in Europe already, and I was asking them to look at what kind of data customers actually want from their utilities, because we all assume that customers want to know everything about their utility and what they're doing, but the reality is most people don't actually care. They say they care, but when you provide them with a facility, they don't do it. And I used to work with the British water companies, and along with the regulators and the government, we put all the data of all the companies, because they're all private in England, and we allowed customers to compare their water company to another water company. And actually, there was tons of data on there, but most people, hardly anyone logged onto it. All right. So I think it's a question of what type of data rather than the amount of it. Radhika, I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Neil. And yeah, such an important point about just also how to prioritize what information is collected and portrayed, and just addressing the fact that there's an infinite amount of data and information that we could collect on anything. And so there obviously needs to also be an understanding of what is actually interesting, what is useful, and what is information that people will actually engage with. So thank you so much, Neil. And right now, and thank you so much to all of the panelists. So now I'm just going to pass it over to Gina and Hannah, and they're going to ask the panelists.
Sorry, Radhika, I don't know if I can interrupt you, but I can't hear you now. So I don't know why it's gone dead. So perhaps you've passed it to another person. So my apologies. It's not your fault. I think it's something wrong with my headphones. So I can't hear you. Okay, sorry.
So it's okay because Gina and I will take over now. Thank you so much to all the panelists for all these inspiring contributions. I think so many interesting points were raised and it really merits further discussion in the future, and we will not manage to do that within the format of this webinar. We still wanted to open the webinar up to our audience, and we tried to merge the questions that were posed into one question. We don't have that much time left, so we will post the question and then we will ask each panelist to respond to the question within 1 minute if possible.
All right, so the question that we have tried to come up with is, and you've seen some of these questions in the chat about the disconnect between those making decisions and those living with the consequences of those decisions. And the questions mentioned things like the commodification of data, or the disconnect between utilities and end users. So looking to our policy brief, which is really central to this discussion, we're curious, what are some of the ways that you see for governments or donors who are making funding commitments? How can we put these policy recommendations into actual practice in programming, in partnerships, and in financing? So that's our question for the panelists, and we'll start with Sid. Over to you.
Hi, thanks, Gina. Thanks to all the panelists for their very insightful comments. The disconnect, the collection of data, the idea of privatization, I think within the policy brief, we're looking at the whole world right now through that policy brief, but we need to further look at individual locations and what are the power dynamics that work there. What might work in, say, a very advanced democracy might not work, where democracy itself is not functioning the way it should be functioning. The power dynamics are disbalanced, and which is something that we must take into account. And this kind of a politics of water and power needs to be acknowledged and included in the discussion around with the funders and with the government as well. Yeah, I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much. Okay, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. There's a lot in those questions, but I think one practical thing that comes to mind, I think that it's always helpful for people to have examples of things that are working well as kind of models to be inspired by. And so, for example, I'll just share, there was a research project that happened here in Cape Town last year with an organization called Sustainable Livelihoods Foundation. And built into the research process, they had stakeholder engagement events, which brought together members from the community where the research was taking place, but also local leaders from the community as well as from local government. And there were research materials that were presented by the community members, and it started off a dialogue with people from the decision-making positions, and there were exchanges and conversations that hadn't happened before. And I think it was an interesting model to see ways that we could move past some of these binaries, break down barriers between who has knowledge that's valuable, and start to work together on concrete action plans. So I think if we can, find models of processes that are working and present those as a starting point, at least, maybe that could be useful. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And now we'll ask for a contribution from Camilo, and with immense gratitude for the ability to translate between Spanish and English as well.
Me parece interesante las opiniones que han dado. Yo solamente agregaría dos elementos. El primero es las investigaciones respondiendo como a las realidades y la manera en que se construye. Es decir, cómo podemos poner en el mismo nivel y buscar mecanismos que vinculen también ese conocimiento ancestral tradicional que se tiene versus el conocimiento tradicional que ha venido primando siempre. Y lo segundo, cómo lo difundimos. Es decir, a veces estamos fallando en la difusión. son investigaciones muy interesantes, pero que el lenguaje y la manera en que se está difundiendo y está llegando a diferentes actores de toma de decisiones no está impactando, se está quedando en un público muy pequeño. Es decir, los investigadores le están hablando a otros investigadores, le están hablando a la academia y se está quedando en un círculo muy pequeño por la manera en que se hace, por la manera en que se socializa. Entonces creo que son los dos desafíos que se tienen.
Thank you so much. And that does really resonate with a lot of what we've been hearing in some of the sessions in the last couple of days. And last but not least, our participant who's also here in New York City, Neil, over to you.
Thank you. Gina, would you mind please just repeating the question? I'm sorry, it's just so noisy here. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So our question is really about this policy brief that we've put out. What do you see as some of the ways that those who are making funding commitments might be able to put some policy recommendations into practice in their programs, in their partnerships, and in their financing mechanisms?
I think what I'd like to see more of is this idea of what you mean by ethical data. I think that's something that needs to be explored, because I think there's plenty of kind of, from my perspective, service and data out there, but this kind of what you mean by, what you as researchers look at talking about ethical data is something I think we need to explore a bit more what that is, because I think most of us probably don't even understand. As you can see from me, I'll be quite honest with you, I don't know what that means. Sorry. So I'd like to know more, but I'm in a sort of position to kind of help you with that and direct that into the utility service. So that would be my one outcome I'd like out of this.
Great. Thank you so much to all the panelists for these thoughtful responses. And I'll turn the microphone back over to Sina.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you all for all the speakers. I would invite all the organizers and speakers to turn on your video just for a minute so we can take a picture together. Got it. Okay. Thank you everyone for your participation, and my special thanks goes to the speakers and the organizers. I hope some of the questions and reflections we put forward today will get into the process of the outcome of the UN Water Conference, and we hope more reflexivity is practiced in the academic and practitioner arenas. And this is a living document to which we will incorporate your feedback and comments from today, and hope to keep developing it into the coming months. And thank you, everyone. We are actually right on time, and have a nice day. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.